Mythology started in 2022 when I wrote my poem Simba, and then I coincidentally kept writing poems about beings from fairy tales, especially animals. And then I happened to be writing Pinocchio's story, which was a reaction to an article. And then when I entered my third year, we were told that we have to write basically a book or a series of poems with a concept in mind. So I realized that basically both Pinocchio and Simba are fairy tale beings, and I just thought this would be an interesting concept to play around with. So Mythologies was basically just like a continuation of these two poems and these stories. So I felt very fascinated by fairy tales, which I think links to my childhood, which was when I was really happy and I was connected to nature as well. So that reflected in the rest of the collection as well. I also get inspired by fiction, obviously, so it's usually poets that I enjoy reading, like Patricia Lockwood. One of her books actually made me cry in the poetry library. It was a very intense experience because it never happened to me before with a poetry collection, but it really changed the way I worked and it made me write more personal poetry, which can be seen in mythologies as well. One of my greatest inspirations was Laurie Anderson. She worked in the 80s, she's still alive, and she released the album Big Science in 1983. And it's basically a spoken word ambient album, but it feels like just reading poetry, and she's incredibly talented. I feel like the theme of nature is one of the most noticeable things about mythologies, so it's a little bit surprising that it was never something I intended to do. But when I reflected on my poetry collection, looking back, I had to write an essay about it, and then I noticed that nature was like prevalent in all of my poems. And I feel like this is because of the connection of my childhood to nature. I grew up in a village and I spent my childhood just like rummaging around the garden, just like foraging stuff. I would just go to the forest with my grandparents and just pick up mushrooms and these kind of things. And I feel like this part of myself is what reflects in mythologies. So it's basically this very close personal connection with nature, and even the connection between nature and my family is something very important to me because we've always owned like parts of land and like we made them private, but we would still like allow trees and like animals to live there. So it would be always like beautiful, and like you would always find this in my book. Even when you read well, you can see shapes of nature, so it's like more directly and obviously about nature. Especially the cover of the book, it's quite like bold, and it was a collaboration between an artist and I, and she's actually from the same town as I am. And we were just like talking on Instagram because she lives in Slovakia and I live in London, so we couldn't meet in person. So I was just sending her posts that reminded me of my poetry collection in a way that it was a similar vibe to it. And I actually ended up sending her a picture of a cup with like thorns in it, and it basically looks like it's something really fragile, but it could really hurt you. So this is how we created a concept of a bunny, and we gave him like this armor made up of like thorns from nature. And actually, the artist said she could see this character in my poetry when she was reading it, that there was something fragile in mythologies, but it was also like very defensive and it just wanted to fight. And this is what we wanted to capture. The interior of the book reflects the book cover. It's also very experimental and bold, and you can see various shapes and like forms of poetry you wouldn't normally see in a conventional collection. I started writing poetry when I came to university, which might be very surprising for some of my readers that I didn't really have a poetic practice before coming to university. But I got into poetry because I had to do it as a module, and we were supposed to do we were supposed to write a song actually, and I wrote just like one stanza, and I remember I was reading it to my lecturer, and then she was like, "Can you read it again, please?" And I was like, "Why?" And she was like, "I just like it." And I'm like, "Oh, fine." So I just read it again, and she was like, "Listen, you have such an incredible talent. You just have to keep writing poetry." And I feel like that one statement just made me keep going, I guess. I can always feel like this kind of a gap that I didn't spend my childhood with, for example, and I haven't seen all the kid shows like everyone knows. And this fear is like just being left out and like not understanding things properly because I just haven't experienced them. And it's just really weird when I tell people, yeah, I haven't seen the Peep Show, for example, The Office, and they're like, how is that possible? And I'm like, it just wasn't popular in my country. It's just like not what the other people in my country watched. And yeah, it's a fear in a way because then you feel like you cannot fit in and you feel like you're like an outsider. But at the same time, it's a good thing to write about. And especially in Simba, like this experience is so obviously describing Simba. The way I wrote this poem, I got really angry one day because some people were just asking me like where you're from, where you're from. And I'm like, well, not Germany, obviously, because that was their guess. And I was just like, I feel like people, especially when you're an immigrant, they treat you in a way that they wouldn't treat other people. And it's just like they expect you to accept it, even though if you did it to other people, it would be considered rude. And I feel like it's quite rude to ask someone like forcefully where you're from, where's your accent from, and it always made me uncomfortable in my during my personal life. And this is why I wrote Simba, which is like a little bit like a rant against these people. And I'm just like, can you just accept that I'm from London, I live here, and yeah, you don't have to know the rest because it's my information. And yeah, that's it. I would like my readers to feel comfortable after they read Mythologies, and I would like them to feel like they have a friend or someone they can relate to in my poetry, because there's loads of characters in my poetry that get into like horrible situations which are real life like experiences that are possible. And if any of my readers were in these situations, my poetry usually concludes in a positive or in like a very neutral way. I feel like by creating these characters, my readers are provided some sort of a space, some sort of a safe space or a character, maybe like a comfort character. And I would just like them to feel not alone in their troubles and like in their suffering, suffering, in their trauma. And I would like them to like have this sort of a space they can like run to, like a safe space they can be themselves in, and maybe try to just move on from their own situations to different worlds. Social media and anything I post there is very much a part of my book. And I do this because I feel like poetry in poetry these days shouldn't just be limited to books, because I find it a little bit boring and like not very original. And I just feel like when I can use visuals on Instagram or any social media, it's just like it makes me more creative, but at the same time it's more accessible to people. So it makes poetry more easy to market as well. It's very easy to like release poetry as music. So basically what I usually do is that I choose poems that I release as singles, which you can see on my social media, like Pappy Wolf or The Diary of a House Person. You can see them there with pictures and visuals and with me as a model in them. And basically, I do this to showcase my poetry in a different way, maybe more engaging, because I feel like young people are just like so captivated by visuals, and like even TikTok or like Instagram is all like based on visuals. And I'm like, why not to do the same thing? If people watch this, if they give this attention, it's like good to do something that's both trendy but also very clever. So I feel like it's a blend of me trying to market my poetry, but also like just using the experience I had in the past, like being a person who has experience with fine art and like performance. Just like I feel like blending multiple art forms can make something more interesting and accessible. If that makes sense.